So, how many people are online? Good morning, everybody. It's good to see the gathering in large numbers today within the office. And I also feel in the last 1.5 months to talk everyday science and the activities related to science, because in the last 14 years so, although I did a lot of work on science, but not so much on a daily basis. So this is one good thing after joining here. And I'm happy to kick off this seminar today by Professor Jayaraman. Jayaraman, as we know, is a renowned scientist from Tata Institute of Social Sciences from Bombay. And he has been in the area of climate change adaptation, and he has represented India in various international fora, particularly on the COPs, various COPs that happen every year, like a traditional festival. And this is one of the very important politically and also scientifically. And he is part of the negotiation team from India, which is a very, very not only coveted position, but also an important position that he held. And he's not only an avid reader, but also can quickly grasp various things from social sciences to nuclear physics, I guess. So that's what I have seen him in the last couple of months. So that's his, spread or the breadth of scientific ability that one can think about. And I'm very happy that he is giving us something on climate change impacts today in the Asian and Indian context. And since we will be having his services for next several years, and it must be a part of our, say, program, a part of our programmatic activity, each of our programmatic activities, so that climate change can be addressed at length at all our programmatic areas. I request him to talk about this. Just a minute. I wanted to kick off a series of seminars as a part of this. It's good that we are requesting Jayaraman to start off this, and every month, every week on this day at this time, we will be having one seminar by different departments. Jayashree has handed me at least next 4 weeks, and next week will be from Rangalakshmi's division. And I would request her to announce the next person who will be speaking to us in this dais. And likewise, each division will be nominating one person to speak about. Maybe it is very specific work that person is doing, whether it is a researcher, like a PhD student or a principal scientist or whatever. Let us give an opportunity to everybody who wants to speak about their experience, their research, and their outreach. That's the idea. So this will be every week, 11 o'clock, Thursday. And if there are any other, either it's a holiday for whatever reasons, or there is some other clashing program at that time, we will shift it to other day, or maybe that will carry over. But I think maybe Jayashree, you should share for the next 3 months and add up to December. Yeah. Okay. And add me also. After every 2 sequence of each department, add me 1, because I am alone in my department. So, but no, I'm happy to, but that's okay if you, and add Kumaran also. Maybe every 3, this one. Because I'm sure he will have a lot of issues to talk about, and what we as administration have to know. Maybe on a given day, we have a specific issue we want to know. So we will have him also. And I encourage all the field station people to come up and say, no, I want to talk next week. That is the zeal I want from you guys, because perhaps you are the least exposed as far as talking and making a presentation is concerned. So I would encourage everybody to come, and I would like everybody, perhaps in that zeal, one will get only once a year, I guess. So I think that's good, so that we can have a very good diversity of speeches and also diversity of speakers. So with this introduction, I call upon Professor Jayaraman to speak about the climate change issues. Thank you.
Michael, yeah. Huh? Tired? What will happen is this will, and I saying like this. So, yeah, I have that. I can do only one at a time. Oh, okay. நீங்க அங்கேன்னு பண்ணுவீங்களா? Or this I said. அங்கேன்னு பண்ணலாமா? Okay. Relax. Okay. So today what I want to talk about is to give you an overview of the IPCC special report on climate change and land. Now, I think among the reports that have appeared, the 3 special reports that have appeared, all 3 are relevant to the work of the foundation, but I think 2 of them are particularly relevant. So the first one is climate change and land, which is deals with several aspects of our work in the foundation. The other one is actually the report on oceans and the cryosphere. Okay, so that is also very important, and I think we should review that in somewhat similar manner to what we are doing today, but that's for the future. And maybe our colleagues in coastal systems would like to take that one up on their own accord. So what I thought was I would begin by giving you a very brief survey of a little bit about what the IPCC is and how it works, because either people don't take it seriously or people in some sense give undue weightage to what are the findings in the reports of the IPCC. So I think we need to have a balanced perspective on this. So let me begin with a brief overview of the IPCC. Now, as the name suggests, it is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's called a panel, but it's like a convention or a grouping. It's an agreement. It was sponsored by the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP. And the highest body of the IPCC is its plenary, which consists of all the 195 countries who are its members. Below the plenary is what is called the Bureau, which is an elected body. I'll just come to that in a minute. It has, of course, a secretariat. The chair of the IPCC and the vice chairs and chairs of the working groups are all elected. Okay, so these are elected by the governments or by the panel, as it is called, by all the members, which are governments, in plenary session periodically, once in 5 years. Then this, and with a few other additions, the details are not so important, we have what is called the Bureau. Now, each of these vice chairs and vice chairs heads a working group. The first one deals precisely with the physical aspects, the physical science aspects of climate change, but physical science includes not only physical science, it's all climate science, but it also will include chemistry and biology, depending on the feedbacks, etc., which are relevant to climate change. Next, it has working group 2, which deals with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Working group 3, which is with respect to mitigation of climate change. And a fourth group, which is very important, which is the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, which develops the procedures and the modalities and the guidelines by which the greenhouse gas emissions across the world are moderated, they are monitored and evaluated. Okay. And each of these, for their reports, have authors, contributors, and reviewers. Okay. Okay, very good. This is, now I am happier. Okay, next slide. So I have already gone through this. They try to maintain geographical, gender, and expertise balance. So each chapter has a coordinating lead author, typically one developed country, one developing country. Then they have lead authors and contributing authors. The number finally ranges in the several hundreds. So in AR5, I was a contributing author, but my responsibility ended with providing inputs for one table. It's an important table. It's not a table, but it was not as if, one wrote large parts of it. Okay, so it's a huge collective enterprise. Next. So what does the IPCC do? From its mandate, which was provided to it by the UN General Assembly, it provides assessment reports. It does not undertake original research. However, in recent times, they have started, if not doing research or undertaking research, they have started setting a research agenda. Now, whether this is a good thing or a problematic issue is something that needs to be debated seriously. And this, perhaps, towards the end, we can talk about briefly. It's basically on peer-reviewed literature, so there is a cutoff date by which your paper should be published or accepted for publication to be used as part of the IPCC report. So there is gray literature, etc. And of course, the IPCC is called upon as a formal body through its chairs and vice chairs to provide inputs to the negotiations at the UNFCCC and, in several other places and fora by governments, by the UN General Assembly itself, and so on and so forth. So they have a lot of clout in what they say. Next. So the preparing and reviewing the reports, there is a process which we must appreciate quite carefully. That is that the lead authors prepare the reports with the assistance of contributing authors. This is based on a scoping report and a bullet-wise outline that is provided by the panel, which means the entire Assembly of Governments with their delegations. Okay, they go through it. It's a fairly intensive exercise. In February, after I joined the foundation, in fact, I went for preparing the scoping report and outline of the synthesis report of the 6th assessment report, which is due. So what they do first is they have what is called a first order draft. This is circulated worldwide to several thousand people. It's quite a nice thing that it is supposed to be confidential, and usually nobody leaks it to the media. It actually works, except for Nitin Sethi once. That's a separate story. So you have a first order draft. There are about 3 months you give inputs. Inputs from India are typically very little, very uncoordinated. Then there is a second order draft after some revision. This second order draft is sent to experts again and also governments. And along with it comes a document, which is the key sort of policy political message of the report, which is called the summary for policymakers. The rule is that it should be policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. But that, in practice, we all know that is not very clear. Finally, after this cycle, there is a final government draft. The text is frozen, and after the second review, and there is a review of the summary for policymakers, which the governments provide. And this is brought to the plenary session where it is negotiated line by line. By line, I mean literally, is really to the last comma, footnote, everything. Everything is up for discussion. But of course, it has to be aligned with the text, etc., etc. There is a proper procedure in the sense the panel in plenary session accepts the report. The report is considered the property of the authors. If India accepts the report, does not mean that the government of India and its scientific advice subscribes to everything in the report, okay, in the full text. However, what it does, it approves the SPM, the summary for policymakers. So that is some kind of a policy consensus. So as you might imagine, it tends to be rather vague in its wording. But nevertheless, even within that, there are important issues. And the outcomes of this have a very serious bearing on how climate policy all over the world and international climate negotiations proceed. Now, I must say for several years while I started working on climate policy, I did not appreciate this. But you must not underestimate the policy agenda setting role of the IPCC. Before 1.5 appeared in Paris, the ground was set in the IPCC and related discussion. So we'll see in a little while how. So let me move on. Next slide. So what is the full title of the report? It's called the Special Report on Climate Change, Desertification, Land Degradation, Sustainable Land Management, Food Security, and Greenhouse Gas Fluxes in Terrestrial Ecosystem. Only one member of the IPCC leadership could say the entire thing from memory, okay? So nobody else can. So it's called a SR, not CL, SRCCL. The key issue is there are several things about this report that are relevant to us in terms of landscapes and ecosystems, in terms of thematic issues, and open research and climate action issues. So we should take this report rather seriously. So let's start with let me go to the next slide. Before I go get into the next slide, let me briefly give you the list of chapters. So the summary for policymakers is in front. Today, in fact, I'm not going to talk about the summary for policymakers because I felt it was more useful to base myself on the technical summary, which comes after the summary for policymakers. And that perhaps is where our work and the IPCC report, the connections will be much more visible. So you have in the main chapters, you have framing and context, land climate interaction, desertification, land degradation, food security, then interlinkages between all of these, and risk management and decision making for the future. So this is the structure of the report. There's several hundred to do is to give you little bit of context and little bit highlight some of the issues which are relevant to some of our work here. Then what I would suggest is that we have a chapter-wise review in land climate interactions. So I think if we have a more detailed exercise undertaken by groups in the foundation, most drilling more into detail, I think we can get even more out of it. Okay. So next. So this is a very important table. And I am very pleased with it because this was part of the thing that India negotiated quite hard. The presentation of this table. Go to the next slide. This was what the table looked like originally. So you see, even the presentation of the table, in order to convey the necessary policy message, people are very careful, okay? And I'll just explain in a bit why. So go back to the previous slide. What this tells you, this table, is to locate the emissions from agriculture in a manner such that the relative responsibility for mitigation in agriculture is clearly laid out. Now, this is absolutely crucial to countries like India. We have a huge population. We have only 33% urbanization. 66% are in the 67% in rural areas. At least 50% engaged with agriculture or partially engaged. If you say the number will be even higher. For them, if you say agriculture is the site of mitigation and not adaptation, okay, this has very serious consequences. The second point is that for a long time, whenever we spoke about vulnerability, the term vulnerability, when we used it, we always added about how people who are not responsible for the warming, who are not responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, will nevertheless be asked to pay the price for. Now, with AR5, the language having shifted from vulnerability to risk assessment, which is a much more neutral term. Somebody can say it's a human right not to be vulnerable. It's very hard to say it's a human right to be risk-free. What are insurance companies doing, no? Huh? So there is a very important shift in language which we have to keep track of. So this table for the government of India, and we had very clear instructions from the ministry, this was very important to us. So finally, what does it say? It shows you across gases, major greenhouse gases. It shows you what is the emissions. FOLU stands for forests and other land use. Then you have agriculture. And then you have the total from both. This is compared with non-AFOLU emissions, which are basically not from this sector, but industry, construction, transport, all of those. So you take all three gases. So you see this total is 12 and this is 40. So the percentage is 23%. Now what happens is, it is not as if this is the only part of the story. There is a huge stock of forests, vegetation in various ways, which is not only stored the carbon, but which absorbs the carbon. And as a consequence, there is, and because of increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, it absorbs more carbon. So actually the annual absorption of carbon is minus 11.8%. to gigatons, billion tons carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So is the primary sector in that sense, okay, under this definition, a net emitter of carbon dioxide? The answer is no. Okay. There is, unfortunately, a tendency now to talk of food systems. So if you take a vehicle and transport your produce to the market, if you have a cold storage, if you use tractors, okay, tractor emissions were always included, but beyond the farm gate and to the farm gate, all allied activity started being put into this. Now, why Government of India allowed this in the first round of discussion is a very good question. Now, you can talk about this in the context of developed countries. But in the context of developing countries, where you don't know whether it is the bullock cart, whether he carries it on his cycle, or whether, it is coming on the head, whether it is by boat, whether it is by whatever means, of which trucks, etc., are increasing, but only a limited part. What do you mean by talking of a food system? Now, even more problematically, nobody talks of an automobile system. So suppose you attribute to the auto industry every bit of steel and iron and steel which is produced, all the plastic which is produced, everything which is produced to make a car, okay, then obviously the emissions of auto industry will be much higher. So many of us in the meeting persuaded the authors that this food system argument must be kept clearly separate. And then you see these are numbers with much greater uncertainties, and especially in the context of India. So you will find later in the report a very problematic aspect where the general term food loss and waste is used. It refers to the short lifetime of shelf food, and then throwing it away, wastage in that sense, and the kind of post-harvest losses, storage losses, etc., which take place in contexts like India, not always, but very often due to lack of capital, lack of resources, etc. To put the two on par seems problematic. Anyway, but this tells you that this is about 23%, and this is one part of the story. Next slide. Okay, you can go on to the next. So this was the old wording in the draft. Technically speaking, the draft is not discussed publicly, but this is our foundation seminar. So this was the original draft. If you go to the next slide, you will see this is how this got rewritten. So, we really rewrite this. Okay, and it's a collective effort. It was not just us from India, where we try to make the separation of this idea of what is natural to agriculture and what is the emissions of allied activity clear. Can we go to the next slide? This was a similar thing. I'll come back to this. I don't need this. Next. We'll go to the next. Next. Okay. Let me move, having sort of given you something flavor of the context in which the IPCC report emerges and all the various dimensions that we must be alert to in the document. Let me take you through some of the highlights of the report. I think one very striking result of the report is that temperature increase over land is not the same thing as the rise of the global temperature. So global temperature is land and ocean. And as we know from high school textbook, the ocean changes temperature much more slowly, whereas land much more rapidly. So obviously, the increase in temperature, well, very crudely, must be lower when it is combined. However, this is not an occasion for panic. Okay, so the global average temperature has risen to an average of about 0.87. This is 1 here, but I don't think that's only 1 year. Okay, but we take the average, it's about a 20-year, 25-year period, it's about 0.87. Whereas similarly for purely land temperature, the average increase is about 1.53 degrees centigrade. So you might say, oh my God, Paris Agreement 1.5 have we already crossed? That's not the correct way to think about it. Another way to think about it, given the fact that we are in the real world with a lot of problems due to climate, but it's not as if we are being overwhelmed by climate. Okay, so that should help you keep in balance this kind of number. But the land warms up much faster, and surprisingly in the Himalayas, in Ladakh, for instance, I was looking at some of the data, there seems to be warming of almost 3 degrees locally. So the implications of that are not clear. You have to look at the data more carefully, but that's just to give you a flavor. So this is, I think, a very important input, especially when we are interested in vegetation, terrestrial ecosystems, agriculture, all of it. Next. However, you know, with carbon increase in the atmosphere and possibly increase in precipitation, globally greening has actually increased, including in China and India, which is where the major increases have taken place. And this is, so basically this is vegetation. This is not forest. Okay, so it is based on NDVI data, etc. So there is a very important Nature paper which worked this out partly. And so there is a global tendency to increase. Okay. So, however, what is the rate of increase in browning versus greening is quite uncertain. Okay. But overall, there is a net increase. Next. One of the strong messages from the IPCC, SRCL, which is something which should be an object of discussion, as I already pointed out, they see land as the basis for mitigation. Now, you may think of it in two ways. On the one hand, you may say, we have to do whatever it takes to take care of global warming. So why not land also? On the other hand, when you look at the disparate levels of income, wealth, well-being of the population involved, and you look at the inability of industry, especially in developed countries, but globally as a whole, to curtail emissions, you may also ask the question whether this kind of argument is really passing the buck. Are they dumping the responsibility on our heads? Okay, that's an important question. So in all the modeling scenarios, now when they say 1.5 is feasible if we do this or do that, 2 degrees centigrade warming limit is possible if we do this or do that, all of them assume a strong element of mitigation in the land use sector, in the primary land terrestrial ecosystem sector. So the more stringent the target, the more dependent they are on land. The real question, of course, is who pays for it? Who pays the price in terms of incomes and livelihoods, and who pays the price in terms of cost of production, etc. Now, there are, even though there is a lot of claims which are built around the modeling, there is a lot of uncertainty in several specific elements of this, what makes up the total land carbon stock and the flux, what goes in and out. So one very important source is microbial processes and soil carbon. Okay, the raw return of green, vegetative matter to the soil can be estimated. That's not a big issue. But what remains as carbon, how much comes out, okay? Getting this balance right. And in the actual soil carbon stock, soil organic carbon stock, the accounting of the stock, the numbers vary from 300 gigatons of CO2 to something like 1,500 gigatons of CO2. So it's a five-fold difference. So we really have to worry about it. But we don't know also microbial respiration, the fluxes that are involved are also a very important part of the calculation with many uncertainties. So in fact, the net effect due to CMIP 5 is from a loss of 37 gigatons to a gain of 146 gigatons. That's quite a bit. 146 gigatons means that the window for 1.5 degrees is substantially later. So this is something which is a very important area. Next. Of course, everybody wants to do mitigation. Okay. So there are two kinds of things we can do. One involves needing more land, taking land away from other uses, especially livelihood uses, and others which use only existing land, but deal with it in a different way. So the second lot is what is there in the beginning, okay? So reduce forestation, deforestation, and forest degradation. So you shift towards plant-based diets. We'll come to that just in a minute. Reduce food and agriculture waste, 0.8 to 4.5. So really, uncertainty is the name of the game here. The other three are where you actively take over land for other purposes. So you have afforestation, huge uncertainty again, soil carbon sequestration in cropland and grassland, uncertainty again. And this is active carbon capture and storage, okay? And using it through biomass for producing bioenergy, which is a very important part now. In all the modeling which says we can reach 1.5 or 2, we can limit ourselves, they all assume this technology. Whether it will work, nobody knows. Has it been implemented to scale? We don't know. But what it can do, like our famous Jatropha of 10 years ago, is that it can divert land from food production. It can divert land from pasture land, because you might say pasture land sequesters less. Taking over pasture land is both an ecological question and a livelihood question. Both are implicated here. So these are all attended by not only quantitative uncertainties in what you can do, but also policy uncertainties that for countries like India are quite serious. So next. So land degradation. This was a very problematic chapter. And it shows how the memory of a generation, even among scientists, is lost. So those of us who are old enough will remember that one of the first international agreements, okay, in environmental governance dealing with land as such was the UN Committee to Combat Desertification. And the subtitle, which everybody has forgotten, says especially in Africa. It's called UNCCD. So now the UNCCD is a poor cousin amongst all the other agreements. Okay? So the authors produced a report where they said the large numbers of people will be affected. And these large numbers will be mainly in South Asia, Southeast Asia, I think partly, Middle East, West Asia, and they completely did not mention Africa. Now, what was the problem? The problem was being authors from European universities. They calculated that absolute number of people affected. In absolute number of people affected in anything, from COVID-19 to land degradation, it will be India because we are simply a much bigger country. And if we are not there in front, our neighbor will be in front, China. So people like Gabon, people like Nigeria, people like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Sub-Saharan Africa were completely upset. So, you know, there are issues like this in the way this kind of assessments happen. But of course, it's very important that there is a two-way relationship between land use, land degradation and climate change. Degraded land does not support vegetation. It can sequester less carbon in various forms, including internally. So there is that aspect. Then, of course, climate change aggravates through runoff, extreme events, etc. It aggravates the question of land degradation. However, and this is a very important point, and this is something one of my students is also very interested, and all of us in the group have been thinking about it. So, land degradation, it's a linkages, okay, to individual stressors. There is quite a lot of work. So there is drought is taken care of. There is extreme event is taken care of. Loss of soil moisture individually people have done. People have done a lot of things, okay? Or even practice is being dealt with. We do not have a comprehensive view of multiple stressors. Now, this requires new methodology. Not as far as we go with our usual regression, with a logarithmic variable, with variable squared, we've reached the end of the road group. This is something we would really like to focus on. Multiple stressors. See, I can give you a very practical problem. Take Kerala landslides. Kerala landslides, where it happened in 2019 does not happen in 2018. Now, why is that? Because the erosion part of the story begins in 2018, but is not directly manifest. Then the northeast monsoon in that particular locality, all you need is 1 square kilometer, falls short. So the soil dries up and the soil crumbles. And next, when 2019, there is an extreme event, the whole thing comes down. So, you know, so this interplay of the dry-wet cycle is critical to land degradation in this form. And landslide in Kerala is very much part of this story we are talking about here. So this is a very simple example of how this thing works. Next. Oh, this is a terrible graph, but I will not apologize. It's their graph. So IPCC's problem. So this is the yield change under RCP 8.5 So what happens is it shows where yield increases and yield decreases. Now you know why a lot of the Russians don't take climate change too seriously. Because Russia's historic problem in crop cultivation has been winter wheat. That's why Lysenko made so much tamasha. Huh? But with climate change, their crop conditions for wheat growing will improve enormously, though all that permafrost methane will kill the rest of us, including them. So, at that I have not looked. I haven't looked at that. Yeah, but also whether the locations have shifted, no. No, that's a very important question.
Yes.
It's not, it's one of those open questions, that we really need to look at. So this kind of issue we have all of us seen at some point or the other. Unfortunately, what people do is they do a simulation under an extreme scenario called RCP 8.5. Now, actually, this is a bit problematic. The real reason why climate modelers like 8.5 is between RCP 2.6 and 4.5 and 6.0 and 7.0, whatever, the differences are very small. So if you do RCP 4.5 and 8.5, the modeling, when you do, the difference is large. So then people say, let's do this. Then they publish only these results, and a very alarming picture of what is going to happen under climate change starts appearing in the media, etc. And the media, of course, between RCP 4.5 or 100.5, they would hardly know the difference. So it's very problematic, this kind of simulation. And we need to understand this. What it tells you is that simulation and modeling have to be improved and fine-tuned so that even for 4.5 and 6, it can seriously distinguish. Okay? Next. I must speed up a bit. I'm almost done. Next. So, nutritional, so there is a food security chapter where the word entitlement never appears once. Huh? So there is this very polite statement saying, food security is not only a matter of production, but also social, economic factors that in India now even children in the 12th and 10th can write. We need a little more meat than that. So it's a very disappointing chapter in some respects because it treats with a very food production, supply, shortage kind of idea. And there is very simplistic economic modeling that tells you price of wheat in 2050 will increase by 36%. Now, really, I wouldn't believe, I won't put too much money on that kind of prediction. So it is problematic, but there is other very important information, and that one of them is nutritional loss. 546 to 586 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere is a little extreme, okay? We are only at 400, so, and hopefully we are not to cross too much higher, okay? So, whenever it reaches that level, production under those conditions. So the thing is, while carbon in the atmosphere may promote plant growth as such, vegetative growth in general, it has an issue with, creates an issue for nutritional content. And there again, obviously when nutrient issues are involved, the role of soil microbes, etc. This is a further source of uncertainty. Next. So now, go back, they all talk of dietary shifts. Can you go forward? Munadi bonga? அந்த ஒரு chart இருக்கும் meat right this one. See, when people talk of dietary shifts, okay, across the world, without specifying where and who, there's a real problem. This is the United States. Where is it now? It is somewhere around 100, 110 kilograms per person per year. Where is Germany? 80. Where is UK? 75, whatever. China has substantially climbed from the disastrous years of the Great Leap Forward to where they are just a bit above the world average. 2012 world average was about 40 something kilograms per person per year. Whereas India? That's 4. Actually 3.6. So, unfortunately, there used to be an old joke about the cricket lover in Chennai. And they would say, when it rains in Lords, they open the umbrella in Chennai. No, you heard this joke. So when people complain about meat consumption in India and say, please give up meat for purposes of climate change, you must show them this graph. Okay, so we have a story of nutritional deprivation. And there are for 100 years, we have had textbooks which have spoken about the balanced nutritional and protein sources, including meat. So are we simply to say all of this stuff is nonsense? And on the other hand, if we are going to replace even just our paltry 4 kilograms per person per year entirely by pulses, what kind of agriculture are we looking at? So I think this is the kind of question we need to probe into much more carefully. Can you go back to? So on the slide, say if you take 4 into what? 110 billion. Not everybody eats meat. So 3.6. So that's, we are talking about, we are talking of a population of 1.2 billion, and we are talking of 3. So we are talking about 4 billion tons consumption. And whereas there we are talking of 100, 330. So comparable. No, that is some. That's an error on the side. I should wrap up now quickly. Next. So go back. No, forward. 8. Now this is something vaguely we once discussed, Bhavani will remember. So this is a very important assessment of the linkage between prevalence of undernourishment and the prevalence of climate extremes. And the combination of low productivity and high undernourishment sensitivity. So our old food insecurity atlas, together with the extreme event atlas, not everywhere you will have a problem. Perhaps Tamil Nadu, you will not see such strong consequences, but Bihar, I would really worry about it, like the floods, for instance. And in fact, if the return period of the disaster is sufficiently frequent, it can be in a position that every incremental gain, every 2-3 years is undermined. So this you will have the poverty trap working out in real. Okay, next. So integrated, so this is, I think, a very quite useful thing to keep note of. So upward of 3 gigatons per year can be saved simply by being careful about food productivity so that more land is not taken, reduce deforestation, increase soil organic carbon, fire management, and post-harvest loss. So these are doable things, and I think you should not. This, however, is very problematic. What it says at the end, and we had a huge debate about it at the final session, is that mitigation is actually leads to poverty alleviation. So some of us asked in private, at the climate negotiations, are we idiots or what? Asking for financial assistance, technology transfer. But this is the argument. And I don't think this argument has been seriously examined in the context of India. There's nobody who has a really proper paper on this or a set of studies. And this is something which we have started some work under our MOEF project, which will eventually lead up to this. Next. So what are some of the issues? And I'll just wind up very quickly. One of the real problems of the report is that there is no meaningful separation between mitigation and adaptation. In fact, one of the, in a debate, these things are debated back and forth. A senior IPCC official remarked very acidly to me. He said, after the 1.5 report, there is no difference between mitigation and adaptation. Exactly, in those words. So it's very problematic. There was, of course, a huge reaction from the floor and so on. But this is policy-wise for us, given our agenda, okay, which we are very clear. This has issues. There is a persistent neglect of differentiation between developed and developing countries. They will talk about sections in developing countries, but they will not talk about developing countries as a whole. But if you look at global inequality data, even today, if you take a citizen in the United States and a citizen in India, the extent of inequality that they suffer is still dominated by inter-country inequality than intra-country inequality, however large the latter may be. So the other is the food system story I told you. And so this dietary shift without recognizing inequalities. So unfortunately, what the IPCC is doing is leveraging this whole talk that has started about quote unquote industrial agriculture. So you will see that varietal development, okay, improving productivity, they will say in general, but removing policy barriers to improving productivity, providing new varieties, acknowledging the role of new varieties from moving us from the the food security situation of the 50s to the food security situation of this 70 years later. None of this is acknowledged in the report. So that's, I think, it's an exercise in, as they say, why the dog did not bark, okay? Things noted by their absence rather by what they have said. So these are issues they have not considered. And increasingly greater result on modeling, okay, which is not very transparent. And this modeling now comes from an agenda which is set by the IPCC. It begins with something called coordination in order to have comparable results. It becomes eventually an agenda setting of what is relevant as question. And they have something called the AGMIP. So there is a consortium called CMIP, Climate Model Intercomparison Project, which assembles results from various models. and provides it as an ensemble average. Similarly, there is an admin. And their viewpoint, I think there are issues. Much of this stuff we haven't even unpacked, let alone us as researchers in think tanks like this, but even at the level of ICAR, etc., these have not been unpacked and understood. Okay, next. Next slide. Next, I just want to show one more slide. One more. Further. There are 2 slides after that. Thank you. So we should not forget this question of knowledge inequality. It's a real serious problem. And it speaks to our responsibility for independent knowledge generation in countries like India. Next. This has had an immediate impact on negotiations and funding. Okay, so that we can discuss later. Let me stop at this point. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello? Anybody from the field stations? Ramasubramaniam, Oliver, Velviri, Shakila, are you there?
Probably not.
Okay. Madhimaran. Okay. Okay, let me ask here in this. Yeah, please.
Professor, thank you very much for a very important lecture, and also highlighting how these things have to be, ingrained into the work what we are doing, so that we will have a very strong point to, foot our research programs. Sir, there are a lot of, important issues you have covered. With respect to the Ladakh situation, when you are saying alarming increase in temperature, 3 degrees, is this the average of 10 years, or what is the temporal?
I think,
yes. Okay.
7 to 8 years. No. 3 degrees is from this thing.
1900.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to tell is, in the last several years,
okay,
they have really seen increase.
No, it's on.
They have really seen increase. For example, there are many physical evidence to say that.
Okay.
One is what we call as tree line. Tree line generally after 2,500 meters above mean sea level. Generally there used to be no trees, but that has moved up to almost 3,000 meters.
Okay. How many kilometers it has traveled?
3 kilometers. 3
3 kilometers it has
away
traveled
from the mean sea level.
From the normal.
So about half a kilometer they have moved up.
Yeah.
And also, if you look at some of the areas in both Nepal, in Pakistan, because I have been there, and also in many of the other Himalayan countries, including in Bangladesh, some places, they're able to now grow apple beyond where they used to grow. So the advantage for Himalayan region is that their area for crop cultivation has improved. That's the positive note of it.
Okay.
And at the same time, I think there is also barrening of certain lands which are not congenial to certain growth species. So that is one thing. The third is, which is very,
Is it
dangerous.
related to agriculture crops or?
Yeah, agriculture crops and also horticulture crops.
Okay, this is happening at the lower elevations.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the most important things which is devastating is the pine trees. Pine trees, they pile up a lot of these leaf. They used to fall and they used to pile up. Nowadays, the fire of these pine on the forest floor is too much. And when the fire, because of the oil and because of the terpenes, this really, even if there is one spark here, immediately it spreads to kilometers. So that is one of the dangerous things that has happened in the past. So this is what is happening practically.
See, why I am very much interested in the degrees of temperature in Ladakh, because that region is key for really diverting the monsoon winds again back into India and the master laden winds, and it is going to have a larger impact with respect to. Yeah.
The advantage of Ladakh heating up is not necessarily negative. Because what will happen is, see, the Tibetan plateau, and Ladakh is the part of the Tibetan plateau we inherit also. The Tibetan plateau heating up is what drives the large convective cell, which goes up, then goes back south, then comes back and comes as the monsoon. So that convective cell will be driven faster, but that's very crude. And I think
Also have a lot of uncertainties.
Yes.
The increase, the temperature, the degree of
there is
temperature.
still anything to do with the monsoon.
Yeah.
Is still a huge
No,
uncertainty.
sir. See, for example, the extreme events that is happening from the Bay of Bengal region, especially the number of cyclones that are hitting Chennai, the frequencies have increased.
No, not really.
Yes, frequent. Yes.
Not true. I must insist
Yes,
on
come
this.
down, sir.
No. See, there are two dimensions here. Let me complete. See, for
Yes.
example, the intensity.
Yeah, intensity has
That is
gone up.
what the heavy rains we witnessed few years before in Chennai. That was almost some 10 years or 15, the rainfall was almost compared 100 years before Chennai had a rainfall of this nature. Either the intensity has increased or frequency. Some in one way or other, it is working with respect to far distant locations like Chennai.
See, the question is the following. Throughout in the, these two things are very clear. In fact, it would have been clear because I didn't spend time showing you the yield story for rice globally. Rice is much more dependent on precipitation, whereas wheat is very dependent on temperature, given where it is grown, seasons, AVO, etc. So if you see the yield loss, even for 8.5 in rice across the globe, much more moderate. Whereas for wheat, it is much sharper. Now, does not mean wheat is more sensitive. I don't think as yet I can reach that conclusion. It is that temperature changes we can track much more reliably than moisture and precipitation changes. So precipitation still has uncertainties. The models have issues, okay? There is a new monsoon model being considered. And as far as AR5, we'll wait for AR6, but as far as AR5 is concerned, all the precipitation results are in medium or low confidence, and even cyclone. Surface sea temperature is a relative of precipitation.
Yeah.
That also has the same story.
Precise.
So temperature and sea level rise, because it is directly temperature related and melting, etc. processes can be tracked. Temperature and sea level rise issues are marked by much higher confidence than precipitation and surface sea temperature. So among these variables, and then I think we can take it from there in more detailed discussion.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Sir, Jairam, sir.
Other
This is
questions?
Ramasubramanian. Sir,
More different management practices, like the practice example. I can give you, so to Mr. Vivek Babu, who asked for a practice which is an example for mitigation and a practice which is an example for adaptation. So even better than agriculture, very simple thing. Will you build a sea wall where there is a storm surge is very frequent? Because you shake your head and say no. But in the short term, in fact, if you take the other IPCC report, they recommend build out in several cases. It works and it's proven efficacy. So here in building out with concrete, you will use construction material, which will lead to emissions. So what is the trade-off? Now, uh, in the case of agriculture, it can be more subtle. Suppose you take a variety which is stress tolerant in terms of heat and which has better stress tolerance, and you take a variety which has higher input use, okay, in some form, and you have, however, something which has a lower yield, okay, lower stress tolerance maybe, but has better properties in terms of input use and say how its root density, so amount of soil carbon sequestered, etc. So the mitigation, gentlemen and ladies, and as we saw very much during our conference, if you are focused on soil health in some way, then you say, that 10% loss of yield does not matter. Whereas if I am talking about adaptation and the protection of incomes and livelihoods, 10% is the margin which is available. So 10% loss is not something we are to take. So this illustrates, I think, the kind of issues we have. So I hope this answers his question. Next. Recommended for impact of US pulling out of Paris Climate Agreement on IPCC's long-term efforts, very bad. So we are hoping he will lose the election. I think anybody working on climate fervently hopes for Donald Trump losing the election. I am an atheist, but if you are religious, I encourage you to pray. Maybe it works. Then, but there was another question. Government of India programs for mitigation strategies, I think not of the kind that Madhimaran is mentioning here, but there are in terms of various agriculture practices, etc. Government of India is quite focused on mitigation. Unfortunately, my own impression is a bit too much focus on mitigation, and given the problems that small and marginal farmers face throughout the country and the sort of never-ending crisis in which we seem to find them, I think adaptation for us, I think, should be very much a more important agenda item. This would be my own, but they are doing a bit, and I think then Ramasubramaniam, the IPCC report is mainly collated information from peer-reviewed publications. In India, not much publications on climate change issues. Ramasubramaniam, you and I should write more papers. Ramasubramaniam has not written enough papers on mangroves. I have not written enough papers on what I am doing. And this, I suspect, applies to all of us in the foundation. So I think, as I tried to make out, and Ramasubramaniam correctly raises the point, we have a responsibility in India to balance the global equation on knowledge generation.
I have an example where I can quote. At least this is in practice, and it is. There are many issues. Also, it is published in various journals in the peer-reviewed articles, but much of it, at least in the Himalayan region, was not taken. And therefore, we started a forum called, it's akin to IPCC. We said Himalayan Forum for Climate Change Action. So this is something which I supported while I was in IDRC, and so many other people joined. So it became about 17 donors giving a. Now last year they sent it specifically for those 1780s Himalayan countries. We did a report. In fact, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because although there were publications available, this was primarily ignored. Even as good as Nature has published some of these publications on the Himalayas, on the impacts of, but that was ignored for some reason I don't understand now. Therefore, we floated an organization which every 5 years goes and starts these things. There is funds to now. Maybe we should do it at country level. We should
Good.
do that.
We should do that.
Yeah.
That's our agenda. In fact, the latest publication, Springer publication from IITM, on the physical climate science assessment for the Indian region. Could it have been done better, etc.? There may be issues, but I've heard murmurings. But I think it's a very good beginning.
The problem I say is I think I'll come back on this question. So one of the problems at the scientific level, at the real science level, is that there is no confidence among the scientific community here. I'm sorry to say this. I have led two this NetCom projects, but still I don't feel our people are confident enough. And I have seen so many meetings where people go and just extrapolate. They just expand the map to say that we are working here and this is. I think that is very rubbish way of doing things, and therefore we need to train at perhaps state level or district level people who can take, like one example I can give you is we bought about 200 automatic weather stations in the Pune Vidarbha regions, and we now started giving out individual weather information to a farmer. It's farmer specific weather, not in a village you give this is the prediction. That is not the case. A farmer, if the farmer has grown a tomato, it goes to him as to what is today's weather and what he should do. Or in fact, nearly 60-70 people have benefited, even the small, maybe because they harvested quickly so that they saved their crop, etc. This is something very good which we did with water, that is what Watershed Trust Organization. So this kind of activities, we need investment, but that is what is required at the very, very local.
See, we have a tendency. So, for instance, India should do this in renewable energy. Or India should do this. You promised, you didn't do it. What is everybody else doing? And we don't assess. So, as a result, they are talking about what we should do. We are talking about what we should do. Nobody is talking about what the rest of the world should also do. So, it's very important that this is a global collective action problem. So I may be entirely self-sacrificing. I may be Gandhi in the second avatar. I am prepared to sacrifice, but that is of zero use if the other country is emitting like crazy. So we have to have a balance of this kind of vision, and we must constantly have a assessment of our own, of what the world is up to. Yes, please, Ranga.
Sir, you have mentioned enhancing productivity is a positive thing, but the varietal development is not included in that part of it. Why is there any reason for it, or evidences are not available?
It is a bit, I must say it's a bit speculative, but basically the mood among the developed countries is that we are producing enough. It's a mood. If you ask me for proof, okay, it's not that easy. But they're all thinking now of conservation agriculture. Suddenly, it's like religion has struck them, no? So, and all of them are willing to, and even in European and North American countries, they are putting the burden on the farmer. The Dutch farmers, while we were at the negotiations for this report, they brought all their milk tankers to the road and opened out the milk. They are losing. So everywhere, the inertia in industrial emissions reduction, they are hoping that it can be put on land and agriculture. So they are somehow they are not interested in uh, growth in agriculture. On the other hand, I think there are important voices, and I have been telling Dr. Murli constantly about it. There are important voices who are interested, who are not being brought into this debate in the IPCC circles. And I think we must look out for these people. We must align with these people to see what benefits we can bring to Indian and South Asian, Southeast Asian conditions. I think so. There's a general mood there, and it has to be dealt over time. Our contribution is to join with scientists who are interested in sustainable productivity and work on that. And I think that can be our, one of the highlights of our, yeah.
In the recent NATCOM phase, the project series of projects, there are a good number of projects focusing on practical adaptation measures in agriculture.
Yes.
So is there any possibility to bring them together as a special issue, if we can take it up as a first step in creating?
I would love to, but unfortunately, if it is funded by the ministry, they own it. So I think the better way to do it is to call some of those who we would like to see on our platform in some way. No, but under the funding arrangements, etc., they'll be unhappy. So what you should do is we should create a conference and a proceedings, and through that, I think some form we have to find. I agree. But though I must say there is a lot more that can be done.
Sir, this is our executive director. January, we got a call from Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, asking Professor Swaminathan report, Himalayan Eco Development Report. I don't know what the purpose, but it's very serious report available in our library also.
Okay.
Professor, when the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, the detailed Himalayans development, it's called Eco Development Report. It's a very useful for us to go through our young scientists.
Yeah,
basically want to know more about detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one question. Let you be clear.
Who is this? Anup Palzor. This is somebody I know. I am from Rarathi. They are not showing as Mosangli, but there's always grew apples here. So, go. Is there a question about that? Okay. So, Anup, I think I have also been surprised by the number, but it has been reiterated by a number of people. Now, you see, 3 degrees centigrade relative to what? So, what is the annual average temperature of Ladakh? I don't recall it off the top of my head, but it is 3 degrees with respect to that. Like for instance, we found this summer, Siberia was hotter than Bangalore on that day, I think, something like that. But that is one day. So when you say 3 degrees rise, it must be relative to what? So I don't think you should immediately give in to alarm. And when we are talking about the trees, etc., we are talking about a very limited quantity, which are where there are shelters and windbreaks, where they are able to sustain themselves. So we are not talking about large scale cultivation, but this is a subject, I think. The 3-degree rise, there is online, you can find something called the Hindu Kush Assessment Report. And maybe it'll be there on the ECMOD website. And there are papers there that deal with it. So if you have an opinion on it, I'll be happy to discuss. I am also part of the committee in the ministry, which is looking at this Ladakh thing again. So if you have any specific comments or inputs on these, we'll take that on board. Just 1 second, Harira.
No, switch on the mic. Hello. As you said that IPCC, they are just generating data from only the peer-reviewed journals. Actually, they are not doing any research on them. Actually, so what is your view on the credibility of IPCC itself? Actually,
No. I think, see, this is a case where we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The metaphor was invented for this situation. So I think we must recognize the kind of manner in which we must intervene, number one, which we are not doing, frankly. Second, we must not take IPCC, for that matter, anyone in science, as the authority. So we must filter what they are saying, because there are many, they survey a global literature. So you should not underestimate the importance of that survey. But within that survey, you must recognize their limitations. And that must inform us in the kind of things we must intervene with. Like, for instance, what we were just discussing, Dr. Rangalakshmi and me, this exchange we discussed. So they may not be focused on growth, but we will be. So, but on the other hand, if they are making this point about soil carbon and the uncertainties in soil carbon and the beneficial effects of soil carbon, and that definitely we should take on board. So it has to be qualified, okay? But we must recognize this kind of science cannot take place without politics in it. So you have to be prepared to play ball with them. You know, it's not a question of not credible. Shouldn't think of it like that. That's my suggestion. Yeah.
You mentioned fire as being one of the areas that needs to be targeted with regard to climate change.
Immediately.
Yes. So what do you foresee will be the status in India? And second, fire has always been a natural aspect of
Yes.
Australian bushfires, because there's very interesting data which is available, which says before the British and others came to Australia, the Aborigines knew how to manage landscapes using fire.
Yes.
And there's a lot of adaptation which is available in these species, because some of them only germinate and develop when there is a fire. So in such a given scenario, the change and increase in Australian bushfires is more a change in the landscape management rather than the intensity of the bushfires have increased because the landscape has changed. And it's because of this that the intensity has gone up. So how do you see?
I think one is we still have to clarify the data and analyze it better. There is too easy a tendency to blame it on climate change without taking the trouble to do a proper attribution study. It's not easy to do, okay? But if you have, like the bushfire of this season, something which is extraordinary, and which has not been commonly seen, then attribution studies are easier. Suppose it is 1 degree hotter this year compared to last year, September temperature, and you ask me how much of it is due to climate change, is very difficult. But if you have a bushfire of extraordinary magnitude or a heat wave which was unrecorded earlier, then we can do attribution. People don't do attribution. So we need to do that carefully. However, there is a more fundamental issue with regard to adaptation. What do we adapt to? And what is the purpose of adaptation? Is adaptation to minimize the transformation of the landscape or ecosystem and the human dependence on it, to preserve? Is it conserving in character? Or is it that it is transformatory in character? So adaptation is on. Like in Tamil Nadu, I get the sense, and that was what I tried to speak about in the Foundation Day lecture. It seems that adaptation is on board now, it's going on. So should we then say, when we talk of ecosystems, species, habitats, flora, fauna, are we looking to come back to the situation, or are we looking forward to a new equilibrium? This is not clear. And I think this is one of the kind of questions which unfortunately IPCC of recent times has not paid attention. We were very unhappy in the 1.5 report with some issues of this kind. But I think we need to look at it. Your point is very well taken, but...
What about India? How do you see fires playing a role?
Fire, we are... Just one minute. In general, in India, we muddle into the issue. So, thoda bahut ho raha hai, something is going on there. How it is going on, how it can be improved, etc., I think we have to study. Fire work has started, especially remote sensing, etc. Data is available. People are taking it seriously. The chain from knowledge management and attribution, but even there, clear zones of vulnerability, high risk, there's a lot of mapping, etc., to be done. So there is a chain of implementation, which I am not an expert on, but I think will happen like many other sectors. You had something to say on fire? Yeah, go ahead.
Primarily, if you're talking about forest fires, then I have an answer. Okay. Are you talking about agriculture stubble burning or the fire here? Forest fires. Okay. See, the issue of forest fire is there for the last 100 years, not today's. So if you want to link it to climate change, I have a lot of doubt to say that it is because of climate change. There is a constant clash between the tribal community and the so-called forest guard community. This is a clash between the two classes, I would say. Nothing to do with, in fact, if you look at, I have at least worked with 7 to 8 tribal communities in the south itself. And every tribal community, go to Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, every tribal community says that we have to have a light fire every year so that we get not only good flush, not only good regeneration of the seeds that have fallen in the season, in the last season, and also it is good for their cattle grazing, primarily that. And what happens by and large is, if some forest ranges or areas successfully control the fire in some areas, maybe 2 years continuously, if the third year there is a fire, it's in very tremendous proportions. This is where everything happens. This is where people, swiftly consider this as climate change, whether or not there is temperature issue. They simply jump into that. So this is nothing to do with climate change as of now, because there is no proof that there is because of temperature. But there are heat waves which are increasing every year. And those, for example, Andhra Pradesh, which had not hitherto heard of heat waves, there it is engaged. For example, Srikakulam and upwards, northwards, they are now experiencing. As south as some of the Vidarbha regions in Maharashtra, they have started. So that is what unheard of. Maybe that you can attribute to climate change. But if you think of forest fires, nowhere in at least Indian context, we can say it's because of climate change. It is mostly man-made and it is mostly management oriented. Sometimes even the forest departments puts fire on either side of the road up to 3 to 5 meters. If that goes out of control, then it becomes a forest fire. These are all the major issues. The other issues, climate related issues, are simply non-believable.
What is missing in the story, I think, is that we have to invest more in separating climate and non-climate factors. Now it has become an easy excuse for everybody. Climate is like, I can't do anything about it. It's climate. So I think it's like an excuse, So farmers who decide climate. So I think we need to invest in attribution and the separation of climate, non-climate drivers. And that's, I think, a serious. My student Aniket. So hi Aniket. You see, if you ask me about remote sensing, there's far too much remote sensing in the IPCC. They could do with a little more ground truthing. And there's really this a love of global data sets, is a very good thing. Perhaps we in MSSRF and India are not paying attention to global data sets, and we should. But if you ask me, the IPCC a little too much overdose of global data sets. They have their place, but I think we lack the resources and investment for ground truthing, and I think Nagarajan will agree with me on this.
About NDVI.
Huh?
You mentioned about NDVI.
Yeah, not only NDVI, he means in a more sophisticated way, predictive modeling, etc. I think people like Google are very invested in this. Huh? I mean, there are big players there. Short-term climate forecasting on a daily, almost weather forecasting. There is this company which Ratan Tata.
SkyMet.
No, not SkyMet, not SkyMet. There's something else. This is a very sophisticated multi-source use. They even use mobile transmission speed for measuring moisture, etc. It's very, very fancy stuff. And they're using all kinds of data put together to track climate. Huh? I'm sure all of them are invested. All the big data people are invested. So I think I take your point, but I think IPCC needs a lot more ground truthing. That's my personal view on this. Have we done? Yeah. Yes.
Sir, you are talking more about enhancing the soil organic carbon by microbial processes. Do you have any specific models in the IPCC report that says?
I think I am just signaling to you that it is there in the report. I expect to hear from you on the subject after you have read that chapter and that section. I am not going to do it. So I really think you should look at that very seriously. It is one of the really uncertain aspects of the problem. It has obvious connections for us in terms of our interest.
I think that is very commercially important we have. And second, we can set up a standard of soil Like she is talking about soil health and how soil health can be graded based on the microbial activity. For example, Professor Lal the other day was talking about, soil carbon is anywhere between 0.1 to 0.7. So what would be simple microbial activity assessment in these levels as against, for example, a rainforest or a deciduous forest, etc. And if we have to do that, what kind of investments, that becomes more important.
I don't
That's
think
very
there
crucial.
are very specific methodologies to really evaluate it. We really have to get into each crop-wise data. And
no, all that I'm telling is there is nothing exists. That I'm trying to tell that this is something you could do.
Yeah. Quickly, I wanted to make two observations. One is, okay.
One is what Mr. Krishna Kumar says about forest fires. I think, Mr. Krishna Kumar, your comment was echoed by other people in the room. So it's a matter of continuing investigation. Mr. Madhimaran, again, just selecting research papers, impact factor of the journal, I think they don't do it in an obvious way. But what I understand it is done informally. But sometimes, they take a nature paper and they won't take a current science paper. And maybe the current science, South Asian, Southern researcher. That kind of bias is part of the game. But that's why in the negotiations, we are very careful. That's one of the issues we really keep in view. And I think, however, if the discussion takes place within India on these issues, then these biases we can keep at bay. They may not disappear, but we can handle them. Yes, Dr. Harrier.
Very relevant to the point raised. See, for example, Terry published a paper about Himalayan glacier melting, and it created a lot of airbag. Okay, so there are a lot of flip sides also. Sometimes we will be, caught up in the wrong food and things like that. Another very important point about bringing in new technologies into agriculture, including varieties. This is what, good that you mentioned about smaller weather stations to the farmers' fields and so on. Way back, 10, 15 years before onwards, our foundation is doing it, installing it in various farmers' fields, and also given advisories about how to go about. And the Pannai app, where it is also season-based, and then compare it with the previous year's data to understand whether an insect attack is going to happen and things like that. So in a subtle way we are doing, but we can bring in a climate lens to it and make it more projective so that we can precisely say that our work is also more in orientation with increasing productivity vis-a-vis the key points with respect to
important things we should do from projects like this is to systematically archive the data and analyze it.
Yes.
And that's we should something to work towards. Yes. Yeah. Kumaran, last question, I think, and then we have to go for Allah.
Certainly it will be the last question. There is no science in this, okay? Yeah. See, the data what you're showing on this meat consumption per individual, just comparing it with like in the US and China and all this.
Yeah.
India's graph was too good to be true, okay? And I think you had data for about 100 years, okay? So whether you're just showing the average consumption or whether if it's a total consumption, I really don't know how it can be a straight line. What is the source of this data and then how reliable is this data?
See, the point is, it is not a straight line. But compared to the scale of other people, the variation is so small.
So, but 100 years back, say the population would have been probably like 1/7 or 1/8 of like what we are today. Okay, despite whether if it's a total consumption or whether if it's average consumption, when we know that especially in the last 2-3 decades, when the purchasing power has really increased and the dietary habits have completely changed, it was too good to be true. I just want to make that observation. That's it.
See, we have data roughly till about 2013. The livestock is well accounted for by the livestock census. Okay. Now, especially in the last 15-20 years, with the introduction of state agencies that are invested in development, marketing, etc., our data on this is increasingly better. Okay, so I really think, suppose we were off by a factor of 2. Or even 10. No, 10 will be world average. So we are off by a factor of 2, which I think is that much error will not happen. Then it will still be a fair.
We are only world average.
Huh?
We are only world average, not beyond that.
No, but if we are 10, the world average will go up. And then we will be lower than world average. So we have to work out the numbers. But I think it's not a data issue. It's really.
See, there are 2 aspects to think why that is true. Although most people may eat meat in abundance, but they don't eat egg. And there are so many reasons. If you look at America, there all meat will have meat. If you have whether it is breakfast or lunch or dinner, in every aspect you will have a meat, unlike Indian meals or Indian food, which restricts yourself. I mean, some may have Tuesday, some may have Friday, but certainly they eat more, don't eat perhaps more than 2 days in an average. So that may be the reason why we are still, although we eat, maybe 80% of the people eat meat, but average is still less. And even those who eat, perhaps eat only once a day.
I think.
Thank you so much, Jayaraman. It is quite interesting, and also it opened up a lot of questions, not only question, and a lot of interest for us to pursue some aspects at least within our own institution. I think this has helped all of us on how in our own little way can we contribute to IPCC issues, may not up to that level, but certainly at our own level, we can contribute to the climate change studies at least. Thank you so much. Let us.